I'd like to welcome everyone to the development of pediatric clinical trial study budgets and negotiation of payment terms webinar. The goal of today's webinar is to provide you with useful information and tools to aid in developing and negotiating pediatric clinical trial study budgets and payment terms. Some housekeeping information. The webinar will be recorded and available to site network members next week. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Please use the chat icon to post any questions you have throughout the session, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a certificate of attendance that can be used for CEU credits. We have two educational webinars coming up, one in September of 2020, and the topic will be coverage analysis for pediatric trials. The second one will occur in December of 2020. And the topic will be centralized clinical trial services, your one-stop shop. We would like you to take a moment to complete a poll about your years of experience with budget development and negotiations. We will share the results once the polling is completed. These are the results. 13% of you have no experience. 50% of you have 1 to 5 years experience, 20% of the audience has 6 to 10 years experience, and 17% have greater than 10 years experience. Very good, thank you. So now I would like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. Lisa Benson is the Senior Vice President of Clinical Site Networks at IAC for Children. Formerly, she comes from Connecticut Children's Medical Center, where she was the Senior Director of Research Operations and Sponsored Programs, which included the Clinical Trials Unit, Research Compliance, Research Finance, Contracts, and Grants. She has extensive experience in clinical trial management, budgeting, and contract negotiations. She serves as a faculty member for SOBRA and has authored chapters in A Primer on Clinical Trials for Research Administrator. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Kim, and a warm welcome to all of you today. Thanks for joining. I wanted to start out by telling you a little bit how it began for me. When I started to develop and negotiate study budgets, there wasn't anyone there that trained me. It was kind of, here you go, the person's gone, you know, you have lots of experience with this, but we need you to go ahead and figure it out. So I knew some of the basics, but certainly nothing in depth regarding training or calculating in Excel sheets, and certainly the most important part, but what were the ramifications going to be should the budget that I developed not cover our costs? So I hope for those who may find yourselves in that same situation that today you'll be able to feel a bit more confident in developing and negotiating them after this webinar. So let's get started. Kim, next slide. So the agenda for today, we're going to review some of the potential challenges that you deal with pediatric trials that we normally wouldn't see in adult trials. I want you to be able to understand the different types of study budgets that sponsors or CROs can present to you, and learn how to effectively review those budgets and develop your own internal study budget. You never just go with the sponsor's budget. You should always develop an internal one. And understand the payment terms and the impact that it'll have on your institution, and your CFO may be calling you if your study account is running negatively. And lastly, review the important contract terms that impact your budget, and really how to successfully negotiate those terms. Next slide, Kim. So one of the first things when I'm presenting with a trial that I needed to look at is the feasibility of it. And this is becoming more and more clear because we may not have all the resources we need. PI's time are challenged doing clinical care. The patient population may be getting less. And of course, in peds, you know, we don't have this huge patient population for specific disease areas. the degree of difficulty to enroll, will those patients remain engaged, and certainly the length of the trial. But clearly feasibility is one that you should have a tool that you're reviewing to see, is this clearly a study that fits in within your mission? You don't have competing trials going on. We do know investigators, I've had them come to me and say, I got this study from one of my partners, he's doing with such and such, I want to do it. And I'm like, okay, let me review. And I'm like, but really, do we have this patient population or enough patients of what the sponsor is really looking for? So feasibility is key. Next slide, Kim. So what are some of the potential challenges specifically to PEDS trials? Enrollment. We know we don't have like an adult trial, you're going to enroll 300 patients. There may be that one-off vaccine trial or a blood draw trial or something to that effect, but typically if you're doing a diabetes study or a rheumatology study, you don't have a lot of patients to pull from. The additional time, we're dealing with children and adolescents, so your study visits are going to be longer, the consenting process is going to be longer, and in some cases you actually might have a study, say in pain, that goes to 2 disciplines such as oncology and surgery. And then the procedures, right? You just can't normally sit a child down and do a blood draw, but you're usually putting some sort of EMLA cream or some numbing cream before you do that, and certainly with IVs, as well as procedures that need sedation where normally in adults you wouldn't. And then you have these complex and multi-year trials, right? The age of the patient at enrollment. Will they be turning 18? Do you need to reconsent? How long is the study going for? And then another area that always challenged me was standard of care versus research. And in a few slides coming up, we'll get into that a bit more. Next slide. So where do you look when you're looking to develop your protocol? And I found 4 places quite effective for me. So in the protocol, there is that detailed visit section that goes and delineates what is being done on each visit. Then you have your consent template, if you're lucky enough to get those consent forms ahead of time to review, and then the schedule events. And let's face it, how many of us have compared all of those and they're not in sync with one another, and we've had to go back to the sponsor or the CRO and say, something isn't adding up and please provide clarity. Then you have the sample budget that's given by the sponsor, and that's something that we would use to develop our internal budget. But again, I've found that using their budget, there may be items that aren't there. So again, this is something that you do all together. It's very important not to just go by one document. And then study staff. I may be putting the budget together, but certainly the nurse that's going to be part of that study and the PI and any other research personnel would have great feedback to be able to help me to ensure that all the costs are being covered, the amount of time it's going to take at each visit as well. And then lastly, you leverage your accounting or finance department to get your institutional charges for the different procedures that are going to be part of that study. Next slide, Kim. So types of study budgets. I've seen budgets where a sponsor or CRO gives me one flat amount. Here's $10,000 per patient, figure it out. I don't like those at all, and know that you should feel free to go back to that sponsor and say that I would really like the shell that you've built, so you have, because you're presenting me with $10,000, I know you built a shell and that is the amount you came up with. Can you share it, or else I'm going to have to build it from scratch, and that will prolong the budgeting and negotiation process. The other type is cost per visit. So you might see for screening, they're going to give you $2,500 visit 1 or day 1, another amount, so on and so forth. Those are, I don't like those either. So again, I keep going back to please provide me the shell. And again, once they provide you with the shell, you need to go back to the 4 areas that I previously mentioned to make sure that they're not missing anything. So the ones that I really like and encourage all of you to get when a budget is presented is the cost per activity event. The activities are detailed. Kim, next slide. And this is a sample of what one would look like. You can see for each different type of patient care related activity, you have a dollar amount that goes across all the visits. So this is something that you really would want to see. Additionally, the important thing is in the bright yellow at the bottom, the overhead. So now you know, based upon what they're providing you for costs, how much overhead they have put in. And we'll talk about overhead, but it's important that you put in your own overhead rate. You don't use their overhead rate. Your institution, although this one says 28, may request for sponsored programs or industry trials 32. And so that's what you would be putting in. Next slide. So the different components, right? You have your startup costs. Those are the non-subject charges, you know, how to get the study up and running, your lab review fees, your pharmacy reviews, and we'll go through those. But my one important comment that I want to say is they should be standard across the institution. And one of the negotiation tips that I used to do is to say to one drug company to another that my startup costs do not change. I treat every CRO drug company the same, and that these are our costs to get a study up and running. Where the challenge is, and I've heard from our sponsors about this as well, is when you have a decentralized model for clinical trials and that different departments may be negotiating their startup costs. So at one institution in the GI department, it might have listed some startup costs, but then the next time that study sponsor went to oncology, it was a whole nother set of startup costs, and the two just didn't jive. They weren't connected. So again, I know it's difficult when you have that type of situation, but I strongly encourage for startup costs that maybe within your institution you can come up with a standard schedule. The per subject cost, so that's the per subject. What's it going to cost for one single patient from study startup to study completion, screening visits, last visit, and all the costs in between. And then you have your pass-through or event-based costs. Those are variable. So if an event may happen, such as an amendment, you get an amendment in and you would then invoice for that amendment fee. Should there be an extra cost for a chest x-ray that's done if the patient didn't have one 10 days before enrollment into the trial and they did one after, that would be a pass-through fee. Next. So this is a sampling of some of the startup costs, and IACT actually has put together a very comprehensive list through the BET committee on all the different kinds of startup and maintenance and closeout fees, along with a justification sheet that we have for our members. I'm not going to go through all of these, but again, it's a nice snapshot for you to think about when you're developing budgets. Next. So your per subject costs, right? Patient care, procedures, testing, the physician fees, and ancillary fees that may be done, subject costs, stipends for subjects. And I know this is a touchy subject for some, but if I'm asking a patient to come in and spend a whole day in the research clinic doing different things for specifically to research, I want to reimburse them for that time. Travel to get there, parking, any meals that they may have had to get as far as fasting study. And then your personnel costs, your physician and coordinator, nurse, lab, pharmacist, those are your per subject costs. Next. So here's a sampling of those event or pass-through costs that I was talking about, and there's many, many more. Again, this is kind of a sample for you to look at, but as I said, the IACT master cost startup list is very helpful and useful for those starting out to develop their budgets. Next. So research versus standard of care. I'm sure there's been quite a few of you that when you look at a budget and you're thinking that some of this may be standard of care, and that's when coverage analysis comes in and you need to get it reviewed. But one of the things I like to do first, especially if I see multiple things over multiple visits, such as chest x-rays or any type of procedures, would that really be done that many times? There's certain questions, and we'll get into that in the next slide, that you're going to want to be asking. But really, research is non-covered, non-routine charges. Your patients wouldn't get this care if it wasn't part of the research. And the cost of that care should be billed to the sponsor. Now, standard of care is this patients would be getting that anyway, regardless of being part of the research. And that cost could be billed to third-party providers. Next. So these are the questions I like to ask. Why is that test and procedure being done? Would it be done as often? Is the sponsor covering those charges? And should a coverage analysis be performed? I've heard from some of you sites that I visited that you actually have coverage analysis department. Others don't. They refer to maybe accounting or they're doing it themselves. Do you have a policy or guidelines regarding standard of care? Many institutions don't. Many institutions just use what the physician they're working with tells them, that this is what we would do regardless. It would be great if you could have a policy that basically stated that this is how we would determine standard of care. We would ask the division head if that's a practice that's done across the division. And if he says or she says, yes, every one of my physicians in this division does this the same way, then that could be considered standard of care. But typically what happens is you'll find that some of those physicians don't. And so when there's ambiguity, I say that it's not and it should be billed to research. Next slide. So what is the most important consideration when developing your budget? Where do you think we could really lose out if it's not budgeted correctly? Next slide. It's your personnel. It's time and effort. It's for your PI, your nurses, study coordinators, your lab tech. And by the way, most of the time you don't see a lab tech person as part of a study budget. But feel free to add it in if you have specialized people that are collecting the specimens, spinning. That's all time that needs to be accounting for. Next. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's a really helpful tool about thinking about all the different things a study coordinator or nurse coordinator would be doing and making sure you're accounting for that time. Don't forget about thinking about unresolved queries at the end and having to do that. And the amount of time that you will have to spend, or your coordinators, with monitoring visits. Next. Your research nurse, PK studies, infusions. Your nurses can't just start an infusion and walk away. Are you building in that time for your research nurses? The administration of the study drug or device, starting the IV, your vital signs, and then really any clinical tests that would be delegated by the PI. Next. So we were fortunate enough from the institution I came from that we had a lab technician. So I always was able to build in, a fee for that person. And these were some of the things that they were responsible for. Now, you may not have a lab tech, maybe it's your coordinator or somebody else doing this, but this is some of the time that should be built into that. It's not just taking and spinning down the sample and packaging it up and getting it shipped. It's maintenance of those supplies. It's making sure any type of lab equipment you have is regularly checked by Biomed. It's, tracking of those packages after. And again, make sure, most pharma, they all do this, will pay for your shipment, but make sure it's in your budget. Next. So PIs or sub-Is, right? They have different levels of types of physical exams. Sometimes you'll see a complete exam, you'll see partial PE. Work with your accounting or finance department on the CPT code and the cost, because they're all different, whether it's a neat, initial, complete, consultation, limited. There are a variety of fees that could be put in for the various study visits. Your procedural charges, and then PI fee. You know, a lot of times you may not see this in, but I always put it a PI fee that was outside of a physical exam. And this fee would correlate with each study visit for the uncompensated time that the PI would need to spend doing the research portion of that. And whether that's looking and answering queries, taking time for the monitoring visits, what about online training and investigator meetings? So it's important to think about that and incorporate that fee. Next. Your ancillary costs. So radiology is a good one. So you may have a chest X-ray done, and you'll have to know what type. Is it, you know, full set of chest X-ray, and you know, lateral or whatnot. But also then comes those professional fees or reading fees. So there's actually two charges. And that happens as well in cardiology and other departments. So you always want to know the cost for the actual test you're doing and the actual professional or reading fees that may go along with it. The laboratory, a good example I'd like to give is we had a asthma type study where we did a culture on some sputum and it became positive, and we had to keep repeating it until it came negative. Well, I never thought about that, never budgeted for that. So I was able to go back to the sponsor and ask them to cover that. So be careful when you're talking about local labs. It won't happen for central, obviously, but if you have local labs that are being done, make sure there's, if there's cultures or whatnot being done, that you account for potential that it becomes positive. Next. So other budget considerations. As you can imagine, inpatient versus outpatient, much more lengthy, much more prone to AEs, con meds that have to be done. You should account for that. PK studies, is it overnight stays? You know, how often are the blood draws? The distance from where those patients are being seen to do the PK to where the lab is, and the amount of time to get there. Oncology trials speak for themselves. What about specialized training that's needed? Are you being compensated for that? Sedation services. You know, there's a lot of studies that may require sedation, even MRIs or CT scans where an adult may not necessarily be sedated, but child has to, and you need to make sure you connect with sedation services and your CPT codes to ensure you're getting all the costs in your budget for that. Other pediatric specific supplies that may be needed for a lumbar puncture or a bone marrow. We're in the process of putting together a pediatric specific procedural checklist with the different types of procedures done in peds and what type of supplies are needed, what types of personnel are needed, sedation, and so on and so forth. That should be coming out later this summer. And lastly, always think again about time and effort. You're dealing with children and adolescents. Everything always takes longer. Next. Hidden costs. Study holds can happen. Be prepared for that. What happens if you get up and running? And that's why I really think the startup costs is very important that you get those up front. And we'll talk about payment terms and when sites get paid. I talked to us about, any positive lab tests that additional tests would need to be done. What if the sponsor wants printing of electronic medical records, or what happens if you can't give them access and you have to print those records? Completion of CRFs and the electronic data entry systems. And then lastly, audits. I've been through sponsor audits, I've been through FDA audits, and you really need to see if you can get into your contracts that should those occur, that you would be compensated for the additional time to prepare and be ready for those types of audits. Next slide. So when you compare, now you've built your internal budget, and when you compare your budget to the sponsor suggested budget, you need to make sure that you've covered everything, that it included all the components, that it covers your actual costs, and make sure the invoiced items are in line with your budget. Make sure you have all those startup costs, all the personnel costs, and lastly, include your indirect costs. Next. So you've developed your budget, you've negotiated your budget, but now you're also looking at the payment schedule. So when will you get paid? And it's an important question that, trust me, if a CFO or somebody in accounting is seeing that there is an account, a study account that has no money in it, but a lot of bills in it, there's going to be questions asked. So payment terms is equally important to making sure that you're developing a budget that's accurate to cover your costs. Next. So payment schedules. So the initial payment that I was talking to you about earlier. So what does it include? It should include your startup costs. You've done all that work. There should be a term in there that you should be paid after the contract is executed, your startup fees that are non-negotiable and that are that you are going to get, and they're not going to hold back. It's important that you get this upfront, I would say within 30 to 45 days after the execution of the contract. Don't agree to waiting till you enroll your first patient. Per patient payments. So when does that occur? Typically, the norm that I see is quarterly. And there's a reason for that. The sponsors have systems set up based upon the data that is entered from the site and from monitors on what has been completed. It's triggered on a quarterly basis. They review that. Event-based costs, those are the ones that you actually have submitted invoice for. So again, you're going to want to be paid within 30 to 45 days of when you submitted that. One important thing comes up with event-based costs. Do you include your IDC on those? You should. If they're patient-related costs, such as a chest x-ray that needed to be done if one wasn't done prior to the study starting, I used that example earlier, you should include IDC with that. A lot of people forget that if it's an event-based cost, you may just be seeing a box to fill it in the budget of the cost, but make sure you include that indirect cost on that. Closeouts. When do you get this payment? Typically, what I've seen in contracts and in payment terms is they will give you 30 days to get all of your invoices in once the study is closed out at the site and the IRB has issued that letter. If that's the case, be sure that you have a communication with your IRB, your coordinator, and yourself if you're doing the budgets to know when that occurred. Screen failures, that is a really good one. When will you be paid? So typically, I see screen failures being paid with that next quarterly visit. But where screen fails get tricky is when, how much will you be paid? Would it be a percentage of that cost? Is it based upon the number screened per patient enrolled, those ratios? So I've seen all of these. And when we get to, you can do a ratio for every one patient screened, you need to enroll 2. I go to my investigator that's conducting the study and the nurse or coordinator and ask them, what have you seen? You know what the inclusion, exclusion, do you anticipate a lot of screen failures? What would you recommend would be an appropriate ratio of screen to enroll? And you'll be, surprised that a lot of them will give you some great information, which you'll be able to send back to the sponsor or CRO, telling them why you don't feel that number is correct. Percent cost, I actually had this as an instance where they were only going to be paying 50% of the screen failure. I found that hard to believe because I know that my accounting department would say, never. Why are they only paying for half of the services? So when I talked to the sponsor about it, they said, well, Lisa, what we've discovered is that you don't always complete all the screen failure evaluations, that if the patient has the blood work done and they screen fail out of that, they're not going to get the chest x-ray or the other things done. So why should we pay you the full boat for screen failures when you're not doing all of it? A very good point, I said. But we would need to agree that I could invoice you for anything that happened during screen fail and that you would reimburse for all the things that were done during screen fail. I could agree to that. Next slide. So other payment considerations, annual IRB reviews and amendments. I've had experiences where they said, we're not going to have any amendments. And lo and behold, in 6 months, we have an amendment. Same thing, this is only a year-long study. Oops, we have to lengthen the enrollment. So even though they may say there's not, you always should put it in for as one of those pass-through costs. So if it should happen, you're going to get paid. If it doesn't, you don't get paid. Safety reports. I've seen that they have started to cap safety reports. I'm not a big fan of this either, because what happens if they cap me at 10 and I have 20? So again, I work on language to say up to 50 and then we'll renegotiate, so that door is open for negotiation and not that I won't get paid should they happen. Excessive monitoring visits, right? How many of us have seen a tremendous amount of turnover in monitoring visits with the CRAs, and you have a new one come and they are there and you have to introduce them to your EHR system and they want to see other things. They tell you, oh, no, I don't do it this way. I know your old monitor did, but now you need to change this and that. I actually have a clause that I put in into the contract that speaks to excessive monitoring visits should it relate to the turnover of staff at the sponsor or CRO, or should the monitoring visits want to occur because they have another hospital or institution down the street and they figured they'd do 2 for 1. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. Withholding percent of payment, right? That's pretty common. I've talked to some sites, they don't allow it. That could be an impasse that you're not able to negotiate the budget and get that trial. But other sites, it's pretty common, 10 to 15%. I would not do or advise anything more than 15%. That really, you're keeping a lot of money until the end of the study to get paid. And then again, when is your final payment? Make sure that it's done in a respectable amount of time so that you can get your study reconciled and close it out. Next. So now we're going to move on to actually negotiating the budget and the payment terms. And how can we become successful in doing this so it's a win-win for all? Next. First, I'm going to touch upon just some agreements that you may see. So we know about the confidentiality agreements that come before you can even get a protocol. And IACT is working really hard with our sponsors and our sites, as you know, to put master confidentiality agreements in place with our member sponsors to speed up that process. There are registry agreements. So registry agreements tend not to have lengthy budgets. It's kind of, we just want you to collect some data or send some data in. And so you're not going to see complex budgets in that. But your clinical trial agreements do. And I want master clinical trial agreements. I want sites to be able to negotiate those startup costs up front with their master clinical trial agreements so that they're good for a year, so that if you have a study, as I said earlier, in GI or in pulmonary or in endo, your startup costs for your institution are done. You can review them on an annual basis because your costs do go up. But it is a way to save time and burden on the site and on the sponsor. But most importantly, getting a master clinical trial agreement executed in a quick time to be able to get those protocols to your patients and treatment to your patients sooner rather than later. So you negotiate those terms on indemnification and confidentiality and all those IP things upfront, and then a work order would come under the master agreement. And I know you, as my sites out there, knowing that we're really pushing hard for our members to get those master agreements in place with those of you who don't already have it. Next. Common clauses in a CTA, of course, are the budget and payment term and publication rights. We always want to have that ability to be able to publish after the sponsor has had X amount of time to publish, but certainly publish your own data. When can you terminate? And of course, the subject injury indemnification is very important. Make sure it matches within your contract of who's paying for what. And the same goes for the consent form, that all matches up. And one way that we always have to make sure it matches up is if your IRB is AHRP accredited. Next. So again, it's important, compare the informed consent, the clinical trial agreement. Do they match? Who's paying for what and to whom? Do you have an institutional template in place to make sure that this is being checked by all the parties involved? And is your institution an AHRP accredited? Next. So other important terms in the contract, right? This is some language that I've provided that's just some alternative that you can think about. But I always found it difficult when a sponsor requested or CRO that submissions of CRFs within 3 days of the study visit. At times I didn't have lab tests back yet. I had a vacation, one of my staff had a vacation days the next 2 days. And so I like to use, sites will use reasonable effort to submit within 5 business days of the study visit. But should extenuating circumstances arise and CRFs cannot be submitted, that we would notify the study monitor or sponsor. What if my coordinator got very ill and was at home for an extended time? That would be, be back in day 7 and not on 5. So things like that. Next. The monitoring visits, this is the one I alluded to earlier. We'll be making monitoring visits every 4 to 6 weeks during the course of the study. And the study center will use reasonable efforts to cooperate. But if additional monuments occur due to reasons specific to the sponsor, the site may invoice for the additional time and effort. And so that is language that I have put in to ensure that we are paid. Now, if my coordinator isn't doing a good job and they have to come back, or we're enrolling at a rapid rate, those are reasonable reasons to come more frequently. Next. So now we're going to get on to negotiation, and this is important to know. So who negotiates? Is it a contract officer? Is it an administrator, someone in the legal office, your PI? God forbid, but it happens. And who's involved in the process of it all, right? Who, when you come against a term or a paragraph in which, this really doesn't make sense, who are you bringing it back to ensure you actually can do it? And then what are the levels of approval needed? I always like to ask the sponsor, CRO, who are you that's negotiating? Are you within the contracting office? Is there a point of escalation that somebody else needs to sign off on this? And so those are good questions to ask and set the tone and the relationship with the person you're dealing with. Next. These are some of the challenges that I think happen and can really bog down the process of contract negotiation. So as I alluded to, the role and authority of the people who are doing the negotiations is really unclear and not consistent. Agreeing to things that you may not be able to accept and not knowing that up front. Not paying enough attention to the process itself, right? We start the process, we send in our red line, and then it's at the sponsor for a while, and then we're off doing all different things, and it's like a month later, hey, whatever happened to that? So making sure that you're paying attention to the process, is it moving along or has it stalled? Not being prepared, not doing your homework ahead of time, not really reading the things that really make sense. And big, I can't stress this enough, the rationale and justification behind why you are disputing a cost. So it's not just saying, well, we don't agree with you paying $50 for a chest x-ray. The reason we can't agree to you paying for that chest x-ray at the rate of $50 is because our institutional cost is this, and it entails X, Y, and Z. And therefore, this is why this cost is much higher than what your cost is. So that's providing rationale and justification. And then again, really important, the communication delays track back and forth. And I used to have a contract tracker that would show me where are the delays, how much time was it at the sponsor, how much time is it here, making sure that we have continued follow-ups with them. Next. So some key strategies, set the tone. I said earlier, be fair, communicate clearly, listen to what they have to say, make sure you can justify. Always be courteous. Hey, I've had a bad day. I've gotten on the call and I'm like, I can't believe we're at this again. And you know what? I've just gone ahead and said, you know what, can we reschedule till tomorrow? I'd be in a much better frame of mind. Be firm, and when you need to be, but give a little, right? It's always a good feeling. You've gone and negotiated at a car dealership, right? And you like when they come down because you asked them to come down and they've done it, versus just standing, on your feet saying, no, I'm not doing it. Lastly, don't be afraid to say no. I've had studies we just couldn't agree to, but I've always ended it with, please come back. There might be another study down the future where we can come to terms with the budget and contracting terms, and love to entertain any new projects you may have. And lastly, always summarize the agreement. You've just spent this long process. So if you're talking on the phone, make notes, summarize, we've agreed upon this. And those notes help for the next person that may come in a year down the road when the study is still going on and say, how do we come up with this? You would have the ability to go back and look at a paper trail of how you came about that. Next. So desired negotiation outcomes is really when both parties are satisfied, right? It sets stage for the next time and a good working relationship. I can't tell you, we're dealing with sponsors now, and when I bring sites names up, they'll say, oh, that was a really good site to work with. Yeah, we really like them. Or I'm working with my sites and they say, oh, I've worked with their contracting folks and I cringe because it wasn't a good experience. Or yes, we have a great relationship with that sponsor. So really, it works on both sides. And in the end, we're in this together with our sponsor partners and our CROs. We're wanting to get these known protocols through and get the results so we can treat our children. Next. So when you have a successful contract negotiation, it does lead to the ability to renegotiate some terms, right? If you're enrolling and you see that you've missed a line item or didn't envision that nurse was going to take that long on these visits, and you're seeing that your study is running in the negative and you're not covering your costs, it really helps when you can go back to that person and renegotiate. And I'll tell you, I've had this happen, and they are willing to work with you. It's great. You'll have established a relationship with a sponsor. As I said, will they'll say to me, I've worked with that institution. I really like working with that institution. And then again, these master agreements really helping us expedite study startup. Next. So that was a lot for this afternoon. I really appreciate you being with me, and I want to open it up now to the question and answer session of our webinar. So I'm going to open it up. I hope you all have been sending in some questions, and I'm going to go to Grace. I think Grace is hopefully have some questions for me.
So we do have some questions already here.
Great. Hi, Grace.
Hi. So in reviewing the sponsor's budget, they only offer 20% indirect cost, and my site is used to getting more than that. Can we negotiate the indirect rate?
Good question. Yes, absolutely. You should have within your institution and work with whomever you need to on establish indirect cost rates. Now, many institutions you have a federal, if you're doing grants, federal negotiated rate for research. Then you have one for sponsored programs. Typically, there'd be another one for industry-sponsored trials, maybe one for investigator-initiated sponsored trials, and then something surrounding foundation trials. And foundation trials that are being funded by foundations typically have a fixed IDC rate. You should always use your internal established indirect cost rate. One, I don't fluctuate on it. At Connecticut Children's, we were, I believe, at 32 when I left. And again, if I got a indirect cost rate on a budget from a sponsor that said 35, I would only use 32. If I got an indirect cost rate that said 28 from a sponsor, I would only use 32. And my rationale, I would put it on paper. This is our established industry-sponsored indirect cost rate that is not fluctuated between sponsors.
Great, thank you. And for anyone else out there that has additional questions, if you want to use the chat function, I can add those into the questions that have come in as well. Another question. In the payment terms section of the contract, it states that if no patients are enrolled, we would need to return half of the money they gave us for startup. Is that a standard practice?
No, but I have seen that. I've had that put into payment terms. And really the important thing to note here is your startup costs are startup costs of what you needed to get that study up and running. It has nothing to do with patient enrollment. You have taken the training, you have negotiated, the pharmacy has reviewed the investigator brochure and the protocol, your lab folks has reviewed the lab manual. So your startup costs, you need to be paid in full for everything you did in startup. And just because you didn't enroll a subject has nothing to do with that. So that's why in the payment terms, and this is what I was trying to allude to earlier, that it's non-refundable. So your startup costs, you use words that say after that, non-refundable.
Great, okay. Next question. We had the sponsor tell us that the study required online study-specific training before we could enroll patients, but the budget didn't include any line item cost for training. Is that something we do for free? The estimated time for training was about an hour.
Yeah, I've had this happen as well. So the first time this happened, I learned from one of the study coordinators that they had to all do this hour of study-specific training. And they wanted the PI, and the PI was complaining, and he wanted to know, was he getting paid for this? And I went, oh my goodness. And I looked and noticed it wasn't. Shame on me, but it never happened again. So one of the questions that I always ask up front in budgeting is to the person that has handed me the budget, can you please go check and find out what type of training is going to be needed, if any, and how long, and from whom? And I build that in the study as a pass-through or part of startup. Pass-through, I like it there because sometimes what had happened as well is halfway through the study, they wanted to do a retraining or a new training because they amended and are doing something a bit differently. So again, I like that in pass-through, so we're always getting our costs covered. Now, some of them may say, well, that's just part of doing business. I don't know how many of you've heard that, but I certainly have. And I tell them that, no, this is taking away an hour of my PI's time that he can't bill to see his clinic patients. My nurse or coordinator can't be seeing research participants because this is taking an hour out of their day. And therefore, for any specific study-specific training, we would need to be reimbursed.
Okay, sounds good. And then last question, what should you do if you discover you have underestimated the cost of a study visit or procedure once the study has began and the contract has been signed? Yes,
and I bet some of you out there have also had that happen. I know it happened to me. So that's why I said in the negotiating, it's really important to make sure that you maintain a good relationship and feel at the end of the negotiation that it was a win-win between the sponsor and yourself or whoever's doing that negotiation. But your study coordinator or the research administrator is going to identify that and say, hey, there is a problem. Get as much information as you can. Try to come up with how much money that you are losing per visit. Obviously, you've enrolled already, and this is where you're picking it up. So they're going to like the fact that you enroll in patients and that they don't want to lose you, because obviously you're not going to want to enroll any more patients if you're not going to get reimbursed. So I like to have the conversation and say, first with the monitor, because the monitor typically will go back to whomever needs to and saying, hey, the site's got a problem regarding getting their full costs reimbursed. There was an error. They're now discovering that they're about $200 shy for visit 5 and 8. They want to enroll more patients but can't take that big of a hit. What can we do? The sponsors or CROs have come around and said, absolutely. They're not in this for you to lose money. They want to cover your costs. So as long as you can justify and provide the rationale and work with them, I've had very good luck in having them reimburse us for costs that weren't being covered.
Thank you, Lisa. And one additional question came in. So can you elaborate on what some of the costs are that you don't see in sponsors' budgets that sites should be looking out for?
Okay, yeah, good question. Well, I alluded to earlier, a lot of times I do not see anything for the labs, the time it takes to do maintenance and all of that. And so again, a lab tech, we had one. If you don't, someone's doing that, so make sure you put in the time for that. Another is reading the fine print Have you ever seen on a study schedule at the bottom, there might be these little asterisks or the letters that make you go to the line item, and then you read and it's like, oh my God, this was a dermatology study and it's asking for pictures to be taken of the lesion, but I didn't see that in the study budget. So it's really important to read the fine print and think about what types of things are going to trickle down from what they're asking. The same thing with the microbiology, it was the local lab, but if it turned positive. So those things aren't in a study budget. And again, if you're reading the per patient visit and what's happening during each of those visits, I can pick up there a really good sense of what is being missing on the schema or the budget, like in visit 1, because I can literally go to visit 1 and read it, and then compare it to what's in the schema. I hope that answered that question.
I think that did. Yeah, thank you. And so it looks like we are close to a time. So if there's no additional questions, then I would like to thank Lisa.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd like to add is to just let folks know that shortly you'll be receiving an email requesting that you complete just a brief evaluation of the webinar. It's really important if you could just take a few minutes and complete that and get it to me so we can see what we can do to make it better experience for you or whatnot, and it really helps me. So again, I thank all of you for spending the past hour with me. Stay well, safe, healthy, and enjoy your rest of your day.
Thank you. Same to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grace.
Everybody for joining.